is a window of time that most people never see. It opens in late spring, usually May, sometimes early June, depending on the latitude and the season. It lasts approximately 5 months, and during those 5 months, the animal that will become one of the most visually striking birds on the water is something that almost nobody would recognize as a swan at all. The cygnet is not a small white swan. It is not a miniature version of the adult. It is a different-looking creature entirely, gray-brown and compact, with a bill that has not yet developed the characteristic shape, legs that seem slightly too large for its body, and a quality of perpetual uncertainty in its movements that makes it look, in its first weeks, less like a future swan, and more like something that has not yet decided what it is going to be. What happens inside that gray-brown body during those 5 months is one of the most compressed and demanding developmental sequences in the bird world. And what happens outside it, in the social and physical environment that the cygnet navigates from its first day on the water, is something that most of the people who watch swans at their local lake have never had explained to them. The life of a baby swan is not the peaceful pastoral scene it looks like from the path. It is a sequence of specific challenges, specific dangers, and specific developmental events, each one of which has to go right for the gray-brown thing in the water to become the bird you recognize in spring. Stay until the end, because the last section covers something that happens in the relationship between the cygnet and its parents in the final weeks before the family breaks apart, something that I have not seen discussed anywhere outside the research literature, and that changes how you understand every adult swan you have ever watched on the water. Number 1. The egg. What happens before the cygnet exists? The cygnet's story starts earlier than most people think. Not at hatching. At the nest. A mute swan nest is not a modest construction. It is, by any measure, an impressive piece of engineering. The female builds it, primarily, though the male brings materials from whatever vegetation is available at the nest site. Reeds, grass, sedge, waterside plant material, accumulated into a mound that can reach 6 feet in diameter and 2 feet in height. The interior is lined with down, pulled from the female's own breast. The nest is not built once and finished. It is added to and maintained throughout the incubation period, which lasts approximately 35 to 41 days. What most people do not know is that the nest location is chosen with a precision that reflects accumulated experience in ways that are not always obvious. Established pairs return to the same nest site year after year. Researchers at long-term swan study sites have documented pairs using the same nest location across a decade or more of breeding attempts, rebuilding on the same spot each spring. The site has been tested. It survived the previous year's water levels, the previous year's predator pressure, the previous year's weather. A pair returning to a successful nest site is not simply following habit. It is acting on the best available evidence that this particular location works. The eggs themselves, typically 4 to 7 in a clutch, are laid over a period of several days. Incubation does not begin until the clutch is complete or nearly complete. This synchronizes hatching, so that all the cygnets emerge within a narrow window of each other rather than staggering across days or weeks, which would create size and development disparities that favor the oldest and disadvantage the youngest in ways that the youngest would not survive. The synchronization mechanism is one of the quiet biological achievements of the nest that nobody sees from the path. Number 2. Hatching. The first hours and what they determine. Hatching in mute swans takes longer than most people imagine. The process of breaking out of the egg, called pipping, begins when the cygnet uses its egg tooth, a small calcified projection on the tip of the bill that is present only in hatchlings and disappears within days, to puncture the shell from inside. From the first pip to complete emergence can take 24 to 48 hours. The cygnet is working throughout this period. It is exhausting work. The newly hatched cygnet is wet, temporarily weak, and needs time before it is mobile. What happens in the hours after hatching is something that determines the cygnet's entire subsequent relationship with its species. imprinting. The process by which a newly hatched bird forms its species identity, by bonding to the first moving object it encounters, is one of the best documented phenomena in animal behavior. In mute swans, the imprinting window is narrow, and it is irreversible. A cygnet that hatches and imprints normally on its parent's nose, at a level below learning what a swan is. It knows what it is. The social behaviors it will perform for the rest of its life, the displays, the pair bond formation, the territorial responses, all of them are downstream of this first imprinting event. A cygnet that hatches in a rehabilitation center, or in captivity, or in any situation where it bonds to a human handler rather than a swan parent, does not simply miss out on an experience. It becomes a different kind of animal. It will behave toward humans the way it should behave toward swans. It will attempt to form pair bonds with humans. It will be unable to integrate into wild swan social structures because it does not recognize those structures as relevant to it. Hand-reared swans released into the wild face social incompetence that is not a matter of inexperience. It is a matter of identity, formed in a window that cannot be reopened. This is why wildlife rehabilitators working with swan cygnets go to considerable lengths to avoid direct human contact, using mirrors, recordings of swan calls, and swan-shaped hand puppets to provide the imprinting stimulus without the human presence that would corrupt it. The first hours of a cygnet's life are the hours that determine what kind of swan it will be, or whether it will be a swan at all, in any behaviorally meaningful sense. Number 3. The first weeks, what the gray water world looks like from 3 inches above it. A cygnet in its first week is in the water almost immediately. Within 24 to 48 hours of hatching, the family is on the water. The cygnets swim. They follow. They stay close to the female, tucking under her wings when cold or threatened, a behavior called back-riding that most people find charming without realizing how functionally critical it is. Body temperature regulation in a newly hatched cygnet is precarious in a way that is difficult to fully convey. Thermoregulation, the ability to maintain a stable internal temperature independently, is not fully developed in the first weeks of life. A wet cygnet in cool air or cold water is losing heat faster than it can generate it. Without the option to shelter against the parent's body, under the wing, against the warm, feathered flank, a young cygnet in anything below mild conditions is at genuine risk of hypothermia on a timeline that would surprise most people. The back-riding behavior that looks like a photo opportunity is a survival mechanism. The parent's body is a thermoregulation device. The cygnet pressed against it is being kept alive. The feeding behavior of young cygnets is, in the early weeks, clumsy in a way that reflects genuine inexperience. Adult swans are accomplished foragers. They know where the vegetation is, how to access it, how to filter it efficiently. Cygnets do not know any of this. They peck at the water surface, at floating vegetation, at anything that looks potentially edible, with a trial-and-error approach that has a low success rate initially. Parents actively facilitate feeding by disturbing the bottom sediment with their feet, bringing submerged vegetation closer to the surface where the cygnets can reach it. This is not accidental. It is deliberate provisioning behavior, adjusted to the developmental stage of the young. What the cygnets are doing in these first weeks, beyond surviving, is learning. The specific locations on the territory where vegetation is abundant. The specific techniques that work in this particular water. The behavioral repertoire of the adults around them, which they are absorbing through observation and gradually beginning to imitate. The gray-brown cygnet paddling uncertainly behind its parents is not just surviving. It is building the specific, local knowledge of its environment that it will need to function as an independent bird. Every trip across the territory is a lesson. Every feeding bout is practice. The incompetent cygnet of week 2 is becoming something more capable, day by day, in increments too small to see, but accumulating toward the functional adult it will need to be by autumn. Number 4. The dangers. What is actually trying to kill a cygnet, and how the parents respond. The list of things that prey on swan cygnets is longer than most people who visit their local park lake would guess. And the responses of mute swan parents to predator threats are more varied and more precisely calibrated than the simple aggressive rushing that most people have witnessed. Pike are the primary aquatic threat to young cygnets. A large pike, and in well-established lake systems pike can reach lengths of 4 feet, is capable of taking a cygnet from below. The attack comes from beneath the surface, with no warning visible from above. Parent swans at lakes with large pike populations show specific behavioral responses to areas of deep water and areas with high pike density that researchers have interpreted as learned risk assessment. The family moves differently in different parts of the territory depending on the threat profile. Above the water, large gulls are a persistent threat, particularly herring gulls and great black-backed gulls, which are capable of taking cygnets outright during opportunistic attacks. The parental response to aerial threats is immediate and escalating. The alarm call, the positioning of the adult body between the threat and the cygnets, and if necessary, the active pursuit of the threatening bird, are all part of a response sequence that parents perform with a speed and coordination suggesting it is deeply practiced even in first-time breeders. Foxes present a different challenge. They are most dangerous to cygnets that have come ashore, which young cygnets do regularly for rest and thermoregulation purposes. A parent swan on land with cygnets is a substantially more alert and aggressive animal than the same bird on water. The threat assessment is continuous. What researchers have documented in families with experienced parents versus first-time breeders is a consistent pattern. Experience matters. Pairs that have bred successfully in previous years make better decisions under predator pressure. They know their territory's threat profile. They know which areas have historically been safe and which have not. First-time breeders, managing predator threats for the first time, show higher cygnet mortality in the early weeks than established pairs at the same sites. The knowledge that protects cygnets is partly instinctive and partly earned. The pairs that lose the fewest cygnets are the pairs that have been doing this the longest. Number 5. The gray becomes white. What molt actually is and why it takes so long. At some point in late summer, the gray-brown cygnet begins to change. The transition from juvenile gray plumage to adult white plumage is not a single event. It is a gradual molt that takes the better part of a year and that proceeds in a sequence that reflects the functional priorities of a growing bird. The flight feathers come in first because flight is the capability the cygnet needs most urgently. The decorative and social plumage, the pure white that will eventually make the adult bird visually unmistakable, comes in last. A cygnet in October is a patchwork. Gray-brown base plumage giving way to white in the areas that have already molted, with the pattern of change reflecting the molt sequence rather than any aesthetic logic. The bird looks, in this intermediate stage, genuinely strange. Neither cygnet nor adult. Something in between. Full white plumage is not achieved until the second year of life. A first-year bird, called a juvenile, or first winter bird, is still carrying significant gray-brown coloring through its first autumn and winter. Full adult plumage, the pure white that swan means to most people, appears in the bird's second year, approximately 14 to 18 months after hatching. This extended developmental timeline has a social dimension that almost nobody discusses. As the cygnet molt proceeds and the juvenile begins to resemble an adult, the relationship with the parents changes. The tolerance that defined the family structure through the summer, the provisioning, the protection, the close physical association, begins to withdraw. The parents become increasingly intolerant of the growing juvenile's presence on the territory. The juveniles are displaced, pushed to the edges, eventually expelled. This expulsion is not gentle, it is active. The male parent that spent the summer as the primary defender of his cygnets becomes, in autumn, one of the primary threats to their continued presence on the territory he is defending. The same bird that chased foxes from his young in June is chasing those young birds off his water in November. The cygnets that leave the natal territory in their first autumn are not ready in the way an adult swan is ready. They are incompletely developed, socially inexperienced, without territory or pair bond. They will spend the next 2 to 3 years in the flocks of non-breeding birds, the groups of juveniles and failed breeders and unmated adults that exist at the edges of established territories, learning the social skills that territory holding and pair formation require. But here is what I have not seen discussed anywhere in the popular writing about swans, and what I think is the most striking thing about the cygnet story. The expulsion is the point. The male parent pushing his offspring off the territory is not rejecting them. He is completing the developmental sequence that began at hatching. The imprinting, the thermoregulation, the feeding lessons, the predator responses, the gradual molt, all of it has been building toward the moment when the juvenile bird is capable enough to survive without the family. The expulsion happens when the parent's assessment, running continuously through the autumn as the juvenile develops, crosses the threshold. Not before. The timing is not arbitrary. It reflects a parental judgment about developmental readiness that has been running since the first day on the water. The bird that gets pushed off the territory in November is not the gray-brown uncertain creature that hatched in May. It is a partially molted, socially aware, physically capable juvenile that knows its natal water in detail, knows what a swan is and how to behave like one, and is equipped, at a minimum, to survive the winter and find its way to the non-breeding flock. Everything that had to go right went right. The nest held. The eggs synchronized. The imprinting happened correctly. The pike did not come from beneath. The gulls were driven off. The thermoregulation worked. The molt proceeded on schedule. The knowledge accumulated. The gray-brown thing that arrived on the water in May is gone. In its place is a bird that will spend the next 2 years becoming the animal you recognize. White, paired, territorial, apparently serene on the surface of whatever lake it eventually claims as its own. You will not be able to tell, looking at it, what it went through to get there. You are not supposed to be able to tell. The serenity is the point. But now you know what is underneath it. Tell me in the comments, have you ever watched a cygnet family through a full summer at a lake near you? What did you see? Did you ever witness the expulsion in autumn? The parents driving the juveniles off the territory? I want to hear what you actually observed. I read every one.